Hello, just before the podcast begins, I want to tell you about The Assassination. It's a new podcast series from the BBC World Service. My name's Owen Bennett-Jones, and I used to be the BBC's correspondent in Pakistan, and for years covered the story of one of the world's best-known politicians, Benazir Bhutto. Then she was assassinated. The Assassination is all about my 10-year investigation into what happened. There are already 7 episodes with more to come. Search for The Assassination wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to HARDtalk here on the BBC World Service with me, Zainab Badawi in Nairobi. Has the Kenyan government overreacted to the self-inauguration of the opposition leader Raila Odinga as the so-called People's President? Critics argue its true authoritarian colours are being exposed by its response to the move. It's also put the spotlight on the effectiveness of the Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta. My guest is one of his closest allies, Raphael Tuju, the Secretary-General of the ruling Jubilee Party. Raphael Tuju in Nairobi, welcome to HARDtalk.
Thank you.
Your government's authority and legitimacy has been severely challenged, hasn't it, by the self-inauguration as the People's President by Raila Odinga, the opposition leader?
That's rabble-rousing from Raila Odinga. We've seen that before, and it's nothing to write home about.
You've not seen this before, though. He's never declared himself People's President.
Well, sometimes you don't argue with people like those. I mean, what does it mean to be People's President? It's child's play.
And you don't see it as a challenge to your authority or your legitimacy?
It doesn't. It doesn't challenge us in any way. It's a nuisance because it does a little bit of this rabble-rousing. He's always trying to have some rallies in the city center where he can cause the most amount of damage. Most of the people who go to those rallies are essentially from his ethnic community. Unfortunately, in this country...
You're a member of that same ethnic community, incidentally, the Luo people.
Yeah, but unfortunately, that's how most of our politicians play their politics. They gather their ethnic community, become some kind of warlord for that community, and they can harass everybody left, right and center using that community.
Well, I mean, I think he'd object to being described as a warlord because he has said that in his protests against the government he's going to engage in only peaceful protests and civil disobedience. How is the government responding?
You just mentioned that I come from that community. I've never known somebody more violent than he is. In his own area, the Luo Nyanza, where he comes from, there's a lot of violence in the political process. There's a lot of rigging in the political process. Go to Kisumu and ask people there if they ever have a chance to vote freely. It doesn't happen.
Well, we'll come to that in a moment because, of course, he says the complete opposite about you. But let's look at the kind of response that your government has made to his self-inauguration. The ceremony, the swearing-in ceremony, so-called, at Uhuru Park in Nairobi. What do you go and do? You close down the 3 media TV stations that wanted to cover the inauguration. You resist a court order to lift the ban on those TV stations. You've only just partially lifted it now. That's a little ham-fisted, isn't it?
Well, let's start with the TV stations for a start. First of all, they are enjoying a certain monopoly that I think the Office of Communication in the UK would not even allow. They control 70% of the viewership and 80% of the advertising revenue. For that reason, they've become a little bit big-headed so that they can always blackmail the government. When there was an attempt to bring about digital migration about a year ago, they closed themselves for 1 month, acting as spoiled children, throwing tantrums, and this they do all the time.
So this, you're saying, is about their monopolistic power, as you put it, or oligopolistic power. Yes. Nothing to do with the fact that they wanted to cover this self-swearing in. Because it happened at that time.
Yes, it happened at that time, and we try to be as accommodating as possible from the government standpoint. Unfortunately, there are such oligarchs who are used to blackmailing. Besides, in many ways, the media, if we do the content analysis that we have confronted them with in the recent past, they all admit that their content analysis shows their bias towards NASA. In many ways,
NASA, of course, is the opposition alliance, the National Super Alliance.
And not only that,
but it's a free country; they can support the opposition if they want.
Which is okay. But I think it is important that we should call it what it is. They're an extension of the opposition party. There are many journalists who are working in those stations who had contested as opposition candidates. Then when they lose in those primaries, they come back and continue as journalists. It is inappropriate for people who claim to be professional journalists to take such partisan approach, especially after they have contested seats as members of those parties.
All right, so Fred Matiang'i, the Internal Security Minister, says that the TV stations were switched off because there was collusion between them and some NASA opposition members to incite violence. But they're saying, where's the evidence for that? Has anybody been brought to court for trying to incite violence from the TV stations?
You know, you have to understand this country a little. We are not a nation state. We are 42 different nationalities. It's not like a lot of countries in the West. We are trying to forge a country out of a geographical phenomenon. This is a country with a lot of potential to break into civil strife and civil war. In fact, it is a miracle that we have survived for over 50 years without having a major breakdown of law and order. We have 4 different races from Africa converging in this country. It's a very, very unique country.
So you've got the evidence. You've got the evidence against these members of the media, elements of the media, but you're not going to bring any case against them.
Look, it's much, much deeper than that. I've just talked to you about the media being an extension of the opposition party. I can even go further.
But that's all right. There are many countries in the world, though, Raphael, Tuju, where you have newspapers that are affiliated to a particular political party.
Let me finish this. I'm giving you the complexity of this country. We have a judiciary also, which is a reflection of the society, and members of the judicial system, including judges, have been known, not have been known, but we see them making decisions also which are based more on their ethnic loyalties as opposed to fidelity to the law. When you have media, which is an extension of the opposition, and then you have judges, many of them who are having more loyalties to their tribe than to law, is a much more complex thing to deal with than what you're dealing with in London.
But the point I'm making to you, though, is your reaction to the self-inauguration by shutting off these TV stations has attracted widespread condemnation internationally as well as within Kenya. Ahmed Nasser Abdullahi, who actually represented President Uhuru Kenyatta at the Supreme Court last year, said of your aggressive stance on the media, the whole world condemned Raila Odinga for what he had done. The government had the high moral ground. For me, this is the government shooting itself in the foot. He's right, isn't he? You've shot yourselves in the foot the way you've overreacted.
It is an opinion. The world will be the first one to condemn and to laugh at this country if we degenerate into violence, and even the BBC will find it very difficult to fly into this country, even getting a hotel in which to stay. So it is, which is the lesser of the evils.
All right. I just want to continue the conversation on the media, because this self-inauguration aside, there have been a lot of accusations and reports from human rights organisations accusing the Kenyan government of becoming more authoritarian, looking at press freedoms. Kenya, now Human Rights Watch report looking at Kenya on the targeting of journalists logged 17 separate incidents in which 23 journalists and bloggers were physically assaulted between 2013, when Uhuru won his first term, and 2017 by government officials or individuals believed to be allied to government officials. Doesn't look good, does it?
Well, I'm not familiar with
the Human Rights Watch
Yes,
report.
I'm not familiar. I'm familiar with Human Rights Watch, but I'm not familiar with those specific incidents. But once again, I want to tell you that in this country is much more complex than the reports that you receive. We have all kinds of NGOs, and some of these NGOs are family NGOs or even ethnic and tribal NGOs. So the information that they spew out there is not necessarily objective.
Human Rights Watch, though, when it gives numerous reports of journalists being attacked, for instance, while covering opposition protests, it's not an ethnic-based organisation.
It tends, but the reporters who give them the information tend to have those ethnic biases.
But look, the worry is, Raphael, Tuju, that if a journalist writes something that's not to the government's liking, they'll be harassed. For instance, Walter Menya, a reporter for the Nation Media Group, was arrested in June last year after he wrote stories allegedly implicating senior officials in the use of a foundation to provide Uhuru Kenyatta's re-election campaign with illegal funding. So that kind of person suddenly finds they're harassed, arrested.
No, first of all, what is illegal funding? You will have to define that, because we have very little laws in terms of illegal funding. But when you have people relying on rumors and, ruining people's reputations, I can even tell you that a lot of this kind of reportages is usually because they're an extension of the opposition. And for you, you'll read a name like that and it means nothing to you. It's just a journalist. For me, you read that name and I can tell you exactly which
the
party.
Nation Media Group is one of the biggest media groups.
But by you just reading a name, I can almost already tell you
I could give
which
you
is
so many
precisely,
reports from human rights organisations. So you categorically say that the government is not harassing journalists, that they can cover opposition protests and opposition gatherings and so on and so forth?
I can tell you that the institution which is harassing us the most is the opposition. They lie through their teeth. I was just in a function over the weekend, and if you look at the reports that they made about me a few days back, all the papers reported it differently because they were all lying of what exactly took place. And unfortunately, that is the situation in which we find ourselves. Very many of our journalists are not properly trained. A lot of the journalists and editors are in the pockets of different types of cartels, and that extends to a lot of the society, unfortunately. When you're talking about corruption, we do have corruption in the media, we do have corruption in our justice system, we do have our corruption in the government. It is a very tough job to deal with all these things. We're trying our best, we're not perfect, but I mean, I know, for example...
Far from perfect.
Yeah,
Let's look at... Far from perfect.
Yeah, but you come from an African country, or at least originally came from an African country. If you look at the kind of freedoms you have here, compare that with what you have in Sudan, I think we're excellent.
Where I was born, But the thing is, violence, as we saw in both elections, of course, there were the elections in early August and then the rerun on October the 26th, and 92 people lost their lives in that period, including children. And this violence has really, really tainted the victory of Uhuru Kenyatta, which was accepted by the international community on October the 26th, hasn't it? It's tainted it.
Any death is unfortunate. Unfortunately, a lot of these deaths took place in the opposition areas, the strongholds of Raila Odinga. Unfortunately, we also know that there's so much violence in that part of the country, even during their primaries, where the government side or the Jubilee side is not involved, people die. They kill themselves. And those numbers get into the national figures as to the number of people who have died. And you find that it is ODM against ODM deaths.
It's the police and security forces, according to the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, and Human Rights Watch again say that the vast majority of these people were killed by the police or security forces, either in crossfire or shot at directly.
Yes. And I like
you accept that?
Well, I don't accept
Particularly in opposition strongholds like Nyanza in the west of Kenya.
Yes, in opposition strongholds, first of all, there was a lot of ODM on ODM killing during their nominations. Those figures add up to what you're coming up
ODM is, of course, one of
one of the
opposition parties.
So it was opposition members against opposition members killing themselves. That is fact. Nobody can deny that.
But it's also the police.
Then,
no, it's the police as well. I have to say to Raphael Tuju.
I'll go to the police. No, I want to explain the police. The police are human beings. You approach them with crude weapons, with knives, with machetes. I don't think they should be standing there waiting for you to kill them. We did lose policemen. It will not be allowed in the UK. It will not be allowed in the US when activists from opposition strongholds or from or political players arm themselves with machetes and stones and all kinds of missiles, aiming at the police. The police will act in self-defense.
By shooting people. Kenya Human Rights Commission Vice Chair George Marara says the police have turned brutality into a normalcy. Police have made it their custom to violate the sanctity of life they purport to protect.
If you're a policeman and somebody is coming with a machete to kill you or to take away your gun so that they can use it to shoot you, I think you should shoot them.
Raila Odinga told us it's the complete opposite, that people in opposition areas are actually asking for weapons in order to protect themselves against the police and security forces. Human Rights Watch carried out numerous interviews between September and November last year during the second election and found, cases of women reporting being raped by policemen and men in uniform. I mean, there's just so many that I could just list for you. You look at surveys, you know that the police really top the survey of, having people have the least confidence in them as a public institution. You as a government have to address this. I'm
amazed you believe Raila Odinga. But if you do...
Well, it's not just Raila Odinga. Human Rights Watch, I keep on saying to these organisations, your own Kenya Human Rights Commission, I mean, people who were at residents in the area around the swearing-in ceremony talked about live bullets being fired at
the police are always part of every complaint, but one of the things that people forget is the number of lives that the police save.
But Raphael Tuju, something's going on in Kenya, isn't it? I mean, in the run-up to the August election, the first one, we saw that the IT chief of the Electoral Commission, Chris Masando, was murdered just days before the vote, and his body showed signs of torture. In October, before the second election, we saw another commission member flee for her life to the United States. Something sinister is afoot.
Well, first of all, I regret the fact that this particular official was found dead. He had reported the previous year that his life was in danger. We were surprised that somebody who feels his life is in danger was in a nightclub until 12 midnight, 1 o'clock, alone, without his security, and in a nightclub, and he was having this kind of situation.
So nothing to do with the election, you're saying?
So nothing at all to do with the election.
What is your investigation yielded?
Well, I'm not in the investigation unit of the police. I'm the Secretary General of the party. But I want to say something about the claims by Raila Odinga and his ODM team that they won. They lost this election in February when we finished the registration of voters.
You're talking about the election on August the 8th?
Yes, but the registration of
the result was rescinded by the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
October the 26th, second election, he boycotts that.
Yes, and you know why? I'd like to explain that. Elections are won during registration. And because he found out, rather late in the day, that they had not registered so many people in his strongholds, he went to court over 30 times to stop the elections from happening on August 8th. They tried 30 times.
All right, but Uhuru Kenyatta's victory in October the 26th, how legitimate is that victory? The turnout was around 35%, 27 constituencies couldn't vote. I mean, that would surely raise questions about the authority of his government, at least, his victory.
I can give you the French figures if you want. They're in the 30s. I can give you the US figures. I mean, only 50% of the people in the US voted.
But 27 constituencies in the October election didn't vote.
Yes. The 27 which did not vote because they didn't want to vote. But it's because the opposition visited the violence in these places, made sure that people could not vote. The IEBC, who were trying to organize voting in those areas, they were beaten up, they were chased away. And you cannot come before the law and say that, look, I've stopped people from voting, therefore people did not vote, and therefore the election should be nullified.
He didn't want to be involved in that election because he said the reforms that he wanted to the Electoral Commission had not been carried out. And therefore, what was the point of running in that election?
He should have gone back to the same Supreme Court which had nullified the previous elections, and complain about this. But for him to decide unilaterally, the Supreme Court has pronounced itself on this, and then he says, oh, by the way, as the Supreme Court was pronouncing itself on this, they forgot this particular element, I'm going to add it into the conditions myself. Which law is that?
So what are you going to do now? The government's position is that Raila Odinga has committed high treason by declaring himself the people's president. He says he wants to set up a people's assembly, have a people's convention, have a campaign of civil disobedience, protests around the country and so on. How are you going to handle all this?
Well, we're dealing with a very desperate man because it is on record. He said it himself that this was his last time to run. All his colleagues who had supported him have made it very clear, and they do have a memorandum of understanding that he may not run in the next elections. Unfortunately, like all of us, we are aging, so he has reached an advanced age of 74 years. So this is his last chance.
Will you arrest him?
That's not my province to discuss. I think.
But if he's committed high treason, according to your government, shouldn't he be arrested?
Well, that is up to the minister and the department which deals with the criminal issues to discuss.
So Raila Odinga's position now is that he would like the reforms to the Electoral Commission and to the judiciary, and you yourself have said the judiciary is tainted by ethnicity, and then he wants a third election in August. What's the government's response to that?
It's like a broken record. He's been singing that since 1997. In 1997, when he lost to Moi, he said he needed elections in 30 days.
To Daniel Arap Moi.
To Daniel Arap Moi. In 1997...
To Moi Kibaki?
Yeah, Moi Kibaki, when he lost in 2007, he insisted that, elections were rigged. So he's never accepted that he's lost an election. But if you study the Kenyan voting pattern, if you study the Kenyan groups or populations and ethnic mix, he has no mathematical chance to win an election.
But has Uhuru Kenyatta been a good president for Kenya? This is his second and final term. When you look around, corruption is a huge problem in Kenya. You accept that?
Accept.
Not done anything about it? He's had a first term, he's starting his second term. I mean, I just give you an idea of
This is a man who sacked 13 ministers. Unprecedented in Kenyan history. He was tough as much as he could.
He says his hands are tied.
Well,
he can't do more.
Well, because
he's the president.
No, because of a very corrupt judicial system. Some of the people who are supporting the opposition have court cases on corruption, and they support the opposition because that gives them a chance to go free. But they have court cases on corruption. They have filed injunctions against being prosecuted. The courts have granted them this. And these are non-entrepreneurs who are involved in all kinds of, in fact, we call them tenderpreneurs, because they're involved in all kinds of corrupt practices. Some of the worst known thieves and crooks are members of ODM. And they are running away from the justice system.
And he himself, though, I tell you, though, are you absolving him completely? Because I tell you what Herman Maynora from the University of Nairobi says. He says, when you look at Kenyatta's big projects for the country, they look good on paper, but they suffer from corruption during implementation. He blames the middlemen and the brokers, but also the president himself. He says, I don't understand why a man like him, who comes from a wealthy family, would allow wheeler dealers to tarnish his legacy through corruption. I put it to you, Uhuru Kenyatta's legacy has been tarnished through corruption.
The issue of corruption is something that all the past presidents have suffered from. It is a reflection of the society in which we live in. In fact, any time that the opposition has talked about corruption, I've always asked them which one. The one you were involved in, the one Raila was involved in, the one Kalonzo was involved in terms
Kalonzo
of...
was Raila Odinga's running mate.
Yes, yeah, running mates, They were all involved. They all have skeletons in their closet. They all have corruption cases.
And so does the president?
Not that I know.
Isn't he Kenya's wealthiest man?
Well, one of the things
or at least one of the wealthiest.
Yeah, I would say so. I don't know his net worth. I've never really bothered to investigate that. But you can explain where his wealth is coming from. He is not a tenderpreneur.
Is he the right person, Uhuru Kenyatta, with all this family wealth, the divisions we're seeing now between the opposition and the government in Kenya, and people worried about the economy and so on? Is he the right person, really, to lead Kenya?
Of course he is, and that's why I work with him.
Raphael Tuju, thank you very much indeed for coming on Hard Talk.
Thank you. Pleasure.
This edition of Hard Talk was presented by me, Zainab Badawi. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.